For an awful lot of graduates in England and Wales, their student debt is rising faster than they can pay it off. So most of them are going to be paying a significant percentage of their salaries until they're in their 50s to pay it down. And people are very angry about this. Some have taken to calling it a punitive and regressive graduate tax.
Is that a fair characterization? Is it a graduate tax?
Well, not quite. There are a couple of features of student loans that make them different to a graduate tax. So one is if you pay the whole thing off, you can stop paying. You don't get to do that with tax. And the other feature is after a set amount of time, you stop making repayments whether you've paid it off or not.
But there is some substance to what it is that has people so worked up that they feel they're getting the short end of the stick. How do we get here?
It used to be that a small number of people in the UK went to university, and for them, university was free, which means the costs were borne by the general taxpayer. As more and more people started going to university over the years, that model stopped being viable. So from 1998, tuition fees went up to £1,000 a year. From 2006, they went up to £3,000 a year. And then in 2012, they went up to £9,000 a year. Most people can't pay those costs up front when they're 18 and might not have parents who can pay them either. So they fund it using a student loan from the government that they then subsequently repay when they start earning.
Okay. And how do the loans work? How do the repayments work?
There are lots of different plans depending on when you started university and what your fees were. But the general model is that after you earn above a certain threshold, so for people who went to university between 2012 and 2022, the threshold is after you're earning about £28,000 a year, you repay 9% of your earnings above that level until either your student loan is written off or you've repaid it. And it gets written off 30 years after you start paying.
Why is this so much in the news in Britain right now?
So recently, the terms have changed for the cohort that went to university between 2012 and 2022. And what's happened is that the threshold at which they start paying back their loans, the threshold of earnings, has been frozen for 3 years. Because of inflation, people's earnings tend to naturally rise over time. So the effect of that is to drag more people into repaying more of their loan than they would have done otherwise. And this was a change that was made at the last budget in the UK.
This still doesn't sound like terrible terms to me as loans go.
No, it's not. And there are actually countries where the terms are much worse. So, for example, in the US, people who need to take out student loans often take out kind of mortgage-style loans where it's not a set amount of your salary you repay, you just have to make certain repayments, and if you don't, you go into default, and that hurts your credit rating, and it hurts your ability to get a credit card or an actual mortgage in the future. The UK system isn't like that. It's not really treated like normal debt. It won't hurt your credit rating. If you're not earning enough, then you won't be paying it down. But what's making people angry now is not so much the system itself, but that the terms have got worse and worse. People are having to now pay that back for longer. They're having to pay higher interest rates than they used to. And really at the root of this is that the recent crop of students has just had to face much higher fees than older crops did. For example, when I went to university, my fees were only £3,000 a year. Now they're £9,000. So people are just racking up much more debt, which means that the repayment terms get worse.
Just for clarity, do you have student debt still?
Because mine was lower, and I'm in my mid-30s, I have actually paid mine off. If I had been to university a bit later than I did, I started in 2010, almost certainly I wouldn't have paid my loan off by now because it would have been many multiples bigger and I would have been paying more interest than I actually did.
Right. I was just wondering about the prospect of just trying to get out from under it by paying it off faster.
Yeah, so that is an option. And interest rates recently have become so high that it's an option lots of people think about. I know people who, at the end of the month, if they have any spare cash left over, they will use it to pay down their student loan. There are a couple of downsides to doing that, though. If you know you're earning enough that you will eventually pay off your student loan in full, it makes sense to make early repayments because overall you're going to pay less interest. But if you're not earning enough to pay it off in full, if actually it's just going to get written off in 30 years' time, there's kind of no point in making early repayments, right? Because that was going to get written off anyway, and you're still going to be paying your 9% of your salary against it until it does. And once you've made an early repayment, you might have reduced your loan balance. But if you then get into difficulty, if you have an emergency, you can't get it back. You can't reborrow it. Whereas if you'd kept the money in your bank account, in case there was an emergency, you obviously would be able to access it. So it's not quite so simple. The people who The people for whom it makes sense to pay off these loans early are the higher earners.
So it is maybe fair to call it what some people call it a regressive tax.
It's actually, I think, for a lower earner, in some ways worse than a tax. Let's imagine a different system. Let's imagine people don't take out debt to fund their degrees. Instead, all graduates pay a real graduate tax to fund the whole system. What would then happen is that whereas higher earners now, at some point, have paid off their student loan and stopped paying, under this graduate tax system, they would carry on paying forever. That would mean that overall, everybody could afford to pay a lower percentage of their salary towards funding the system. So for lower earners, this is actually worse than a regressive graduate tax because it has some features that are like that, but they also end up paying a higher percentage of their earnings than they would under that system.
Okay, this does kind of hint at the question I think a lot of people would ask here about. But graduates should there's a price that graduates are right to pay in that they are more highly valued in the labor market, right? That being a student, paying that off even over a long period of time is probably a fair deal.
Yeah, people talk about the graduate premium, right? The fact that you're likely to earn more if you went to university than if you didn't. I think there's a few things to say about that. The old model, which a lot of people kind of hark back to and say it was just better. It was just better when 10% of people went to university and university for those people was free. I have to say, to me, that doesn't sound particularly fair, to have only a small proportion of the population that gets this amazing benefit while the rest of the population pays. I think a lot of the time when people say, that was a better system, they're imagining themselves being among the 10%, right? Not the 90% who pay for it and don't get it. So that doesn't seem particularly fair. Graduates themselves are probably the biggest beneficiaries of going to university. So I think a lot of people would think that they ought to pay something towards that. What's difficult now, and this is another feature of the number of people going to university having gone up so massively, by the time state school leavers are 25, half of them will have started a university course. So the numbers have really gone up a long way. One feature of that is that the graduate premium has gone down. So whereas it used to make a big difference to your lifetime wages if you went to university, over time that difference has eroded. And for some courses in particular, they are typically creative arts courses or things like English literature. There's actually a graduate penalty for having studied those courses. You are probably going to earn less than you would have done otherwise.
Without wishing then to try to solve this problem in this room right now, what about the people who are stuck under these loans now, who are a grander cohort has just been created, they're being drawn in at a lower threshold?
Yeah, part of the reason they're so angry is that there aren't a lot of options for them. You don't get to decline making these repayments. You don't get to kind of take a different decision. And for many, making extra repayments won't be either a realistic or a sensible option either. There aren't that many options available to the government either, because of the fundamental problem that this debt has been racked up. Going to university is costly and somebody is going to have to pay for it. Really, the only options for the government are to either say the cohort themselves are going to pay it back and are going to have to pay more of it, or to say all taxpayers are going to pick up the tab, in which case everybody's taxes have to go up. And everybody's very aware that government finances are strained at the moment, that the government's struggling to borrow more. So that means not spending money on other things like the health service or defence or whatever. So there really aren't any easy options here.
Josh, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Jason.